Blessed is the one who reads aloud the words of this prophecy, and blessed are those who hear it and take to heart what is written in it, because the time is near. Revelation chapter 1 verse 3. The story of the four horsemen of the apocalypse has dominated biblical and historical conversations for centuries. The images of horsemen tearing through the dead of night have intrigued and even terrified readers, leaving us to wonder, when will the horsemen come riding in? What will be the effect? And is there anything we can do to prepare for this life-changing encounter? The horsemen are more than a fictional fanfare. Their arrival is a fact about a futuristic event that will affect us all. The first horseman means mass deception, false teachings, and false prophets. The second horseman means war, violence, and uprisings in the earth. The third horseman means widespread famine and starvation upon the earth. The fourth horseman means widespread disease, pestilence, and pandemics. But aren't we experiencing these today? Does this mean the horsemen are riding in tomorrow, next year, 10 years from now? Matthew chapter 24 verses 6 to 7. You will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but see to it that you are not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines, pestilences, and earthquakes in various places. Indeed, the end is near, but just how close are we? And what does it mean for all of humanity? Follow our 4-part virtual presentation series as we further unpack and explain the significance of each horseman and how we can prepare. Come for the eye-opening and soul-stirring presentations and stay for the lively question and answer segment, where the floor is all yours. If you like what you've seen and you are ready for more, give us a thumbs up, subscribe, and share with someone who may benefit.
When he opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature say, "Come." And I saw and behold a black horse, and its rider had a balance in his hand. And I heard what seemed to be a voice in the midst of the four living creatures saying, "A quart of wheat for Denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for Denarius, but do not harm the oil and the wine." Brethren and friends, I would just like to welcome you once again to another presentation in the virtual presentation series of the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, being hosted by the Church of God International, the Ocharius congregation here in Jamaica. Now, previously, we would have gone through presentations on the first and second horseman. The first horseman being done by Brother Jonah Lewis, looking at deception that is taking place in the world. The second horseman would have been done by Elder Horain Smith, looking at war. And today, it gives me a great privilege to look through the third horseman, dealing with famine. And I hope you will join us, although we invite you to stay till the end of the presentation. Join us next week as we finish the video presentation series by Elder George Ramakan, who will be looking at the fourth horseman, which is death. Now, brethren, in the introduction to the virtual presentation series, Brother Jonah Lewis went through the Olivet prophecy, looking at Matthew 24, and he linked it with Revelation 6. Now, Jesus, when he was speaking to his disciples and they asked him, "What are the signs of your coming?" he gave them a set of things that they were able to look for, to encourage them, but to also keep them awake and also looking around. He went through in verse 5, he said, "For many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and they will lead many astray." And Brother Jonah Lewis did an excellent presentation on what deception looks like today. I invite you to go there and watch it if you have not already done so. He then follows up by saying in verse 6, "And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed." Very important point here. Make sure that we're not alarmed when we see these things. "For these things must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All this is but the beginnings of birth pangs. And then they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death. Brethren, in verse 12, it also says, and because wickedness is multiplied, most men's love will grow cold. We're going to examine this prophecy today in terms of looking at the Bible, what the scriptures have to say about the third horseman, and also looking at some of the current affairs. Now, as I said, Brother Jonah Lewis would have gone through Matthew 24 and gave us a nice little table linking it to Revelation 6 to show the comparison between what we're speaking about. So today I'm going to be going through famine and the black horse. Now, here is the reality and why we want to discuss this. How does this affect me and you? The potential of food-rich countries to feed the entire earth makes it hard to imagine a famine extensive enough to thrust the earth into a worldwide crisis. Yet, the third seal of Revelation 6, employing the symbol of a black horse, describes just such a horrifying scene. We want to examine how could this happen and what would be the consequences. So I'll be looking at the issue of the third horseman. Now, first, I want to go through Revelation 6 just to paint a picture in terms of what is going on. We know that Revelation was given by John the Apostle on the Isle of Patmos. He had this revelation through Jesus Christ. He paints a picture of this third horseman. And I want to focus here on a quart of wheat for a denarius, 3 quarts of barley for a denarius. What was a denarius and why was this statement significant at the time? Here I have a picture of what a denarius would have looked like at the time. It was a standard Roman silver coin introduced about 211 BC, weighed about 3.81 grams. Why is this significant? What did this vision communicate to the readers of the time? Now I want to take you to Matthew 20, verses 1 to 16, to give you an idea of what exactly a denarius was worth at the time. Jesus, in his parables to his disciples, was speaking about the work or joining the faith in the kingdom of God and the different times of the laborers who were in the vineyard. Now, it reads here in Matthew 20, for the kingdom of heaven is like a householder who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. Verse 2 says, after agreeing the laborers for a denarius a day, after agreeing with the laborers for a denarius a day, he sent them into his vineyard. And going out about the 3rd hour, he saw others standing idle in the marketplace. And to them he said, you go into the vineyard too, and whatever is right I will give you. So they went. We read further in verse 8, the ending of the story. And when evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his steward, call the laborers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last up to the first. And when those hired about the 11th hour came, each of them received a denarius. Now when the first came, they thought they would receive more, which is a reasonable assumption. But each of them also received a denarius, because that was the agreed price. The point I want to make here is that the day's wage was a denarius at the time. So when John is writing this vision, the understanding by the readers at the time is that for 1 denarius, a day's wage could be paid. Now, why is this significant? When we turn back to Revelation 5 to 6, we have different scholars who would have commented. For example, Robert Mounce. He says here that the price of wheat and barley as described in the vision appears to be 10 to 12 times their normal cost in ancient times. That's right, friends. 10 to 12 times higher. Revelation thus describes a condition where basic goods are sold at a greatly inflated price. And if we're comfortable with the word inflation or know what it means, we can see that in our newspapers today. So inflation is what was here pictured. Scarcity. Famine in terms of not being able to get enough food. In John's time, a person could buy 8 to 12 quarts of wheat for a denarius. So imagine the picture. 1 denarius could buy you 8 to 12 quarts of wheat, but in the vision that he is putting forward, it can only buy 1 quart. Hyperinflation. To compound things, what we understand is that after the laborer would have worked for a day, you get 1 denarius that can buy you 1 quart of wheat to eat for the day. 1 quart of wheat is enough to sustain a person for a day. Think about if a worker was in a family. The global average size of a household today is about 3.5 persons. What this worker would have to do is resort to going to barley, where he can get 3 quarts to feed probably his wife, his children. And the barley is also less nutritious than wheat. Additionally, barley was used for livestock. So imagine that. You're working for 1 day's wage, and you can either choose to feed yourself or to buy 3 quarts of barley to give the livestock, which will further give you food. So the picture that is painted in Revelation 6 is very dire. Very dire. Persons are not able to work and afford food for themselves or for their families. Now, brethren and friends, when we look at the newspapers today, and I'll get to that later down in the presentation, this is a serious and significant event that is happening to persons in their daily lives. And a lot of us can empathize or even think about what that means as we see different persons around us being affected from day to day. So therefore, the black horse rider depicts the times of deep scarcity or famine. And I'll go a little bit more into that later. But first, let us go to the Bible to examine the first place that we've seen famine. Now, we can find this in Genesis 12 with the call of Abraham when he was called to leave the land of Ur. God gave him a particular message about the land that he should inherit for his descendants. It reads here in verse 6 that Abram passed through the land to the place at Shechem. And I want you to just take your attention down to verse 7, where the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your descendants I will give this land. So we know that to be the land of Canaan. However, for the purpose of this presentation, I want to go down to verse 10, where it says, no, there was a famine in the land. So Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was severe in the land. This is the first time we would have seen famine in the Bible. And the word there is rawab, Strong's H7458, Hebrew word which means famine or scarcity and hunger. So we see here in Genesis 12 that although Abram was in the land of Canaan, he went to Egypt because of the famine that was there. Now, we can later find the word in Genesis 26 as we read about Isaac, the son of Abraham, and Abimelech, the king of the Philistines. Now, once again, there was a famine in the land besides the former famine that was in the days of Abraham. So here we see clearly that Abraham, Isaac's father, would have went through famine, but also in his son's time, there was also famine in the land. This time, he was told by God not to go to Egypt, but to stay in the land of the Philistines. The next time we see famine mentioned in the Bible is a very famous story that most of us would know, or who are associated with the Bible should be familiar with. And that is when Joseph interprets the 2 dreams of Pharaoh while in Egypt. Joseph, being one of the sons of Jacob, the great-grandson of Abraham, was sold into slavery in Egypt by his brothers. Fortunately, or unfortunately, depends on how you look at it. Fortunately, what Joseph did in Egypt would have changed the shape of his family's fortunes for all times. But here more specifically, we look in verse 1 of Genesis 41. It says, after 2 whole years, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing by the Nile. And behold, there came up out of the Nile 7 cows, sleek and fat, and they fed in the reed grass. And behold, 7 other cows, gaunt and thin, came up out of the Nile after them. and stood by the other cows on the bank of the Nile. In verse 4 it says, and the gaunt and thin cows ate up the 7 sleek and fat cows. Now imagine that in his dream, he is witnessing this. I can imagine the state that Pharaoh must have awoken. It says here in verse 5 that he fell asleep and dreamed a second time. A second dream now shows 7 ears of grain, plumb and good, were growing on one stalk. And behold, after them sprouted 7 ears, thin and blighted by the east wind. In verse 7 it says, and the thin ears swallowed up the 7 plump and full ears. And Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. Now, this dream was very pivotal for what was about to happen in Egypt. And there are a lot of lessons that we can learn from the response of Joseph at the time. Now, as we read through Genesis 41 in verse 25, Joseph was known for interpreting dreams. He was brought to Pharaoh, and he gives Pharaoh the interpretation of the dream. He says here in verse 25, then Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one and the same. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good heads of grain are 7 years. It is one and the same dream. The 7 lean, ugly cows that came up afterward, after the 7 years, and so are the 7 worthless heads of grain scorched by the east wind. They are 7 years of famine. What Joseph starts to describe is 7 years of fertile land-bearing fruits that are there, followed by 7 years of famine. And he further says in 32 that the doubling of Pharaoh's dream means that this thing is fixed. It is definitively going to happen, and God will surely bring it to pass. Now, Joseph's response to Pharaoh is what I found very interesting. Verse 34 tells us that Pharaoh proceeded to appoint overseers over the land and to take a 5th part of the produce of the land of Egypt during the 7 plenteous years. This was a recommendation by Joseph, forgive me. And he said Joseph's recommendation was to let them gather all the food of these good years that are coming and lay up grain under the authority of Pharaoh for food in the cities, and let them keep it. In verse 36, the plan of Joseph goes on, that food shall be a reserve for the land against the 7 years of famine, which are to befall the land of Egypt, so that the land may not perish through the famine. Pharaoh has a reasonable response. Can we find such a man as this, in whom the Spirit of God, in whom is the Spirit of God? 39, so Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has shown you all this, there is none so discreet and wise as you are. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only as regards the throne will I be greater than you. So what we saw is that Joseph was promoted in the government of Pharaoh. He implements a plan, sound government and economic policy to respond to the famine. What we should also note is that God gave Joseph wisdom, who feared and obeyed God. And we know the famous story previously where Joseph would have ran away from Potiphar's wife earlier in Genesis. Ultimately, Joseph's family, his father Israel, and his brothers who sold him into slavery would have to settle in Egypt, in the land of Goshen, as the region of Canaan also experienced great famine. And in seeking food, they went to Egypt, where Joseph revealed himself and would have helped the brothers out. But friends, as we look closer in Genesis 47 to 13, we can see the extent to which the government and economic policies of Joseph were successful. It reads, there was no food, however, in the whole region, but because the famine was severe, both Egypt and Canaan wasted away because of the famine. Joseph collected all the money that was to be found in Egypt and Canaan in payment for the grain they were buying, and he brought it to Pharaoh's palace. Egypt became a regional powerhouse because of the economic and governmental policies that Joseph would have implemented. And this is something that we'll discuss later on in the presentation in terms of what the world's governments can do. But before we get there, there are many other places in the Old Testament where we see famine, or the word there that is used. We see it in Ruth 1:1. We see it in Samuel 21:1. We also see it in 1 Kings 18:2 and also 2 Kings 6:25. So Israel at the time, they would have been familiar with what famine means. They would have experienced it in their past through their forefathers through various times in their development. Friends, even in the New Testament, we see famine affecting persons there. Paul, the apostle, after leaving Acts 15, they asked him to remember the poor. And we can see in his letter to the Corinthians, where they sought to help the saints who are in Jerusalem. The churches in Galatia, as well as Corinthians, were advised to collect and to store up things to help with the famine that was going on at the time. Also in Romans 15, we see in 26 that Macedonia and Achaia have been pleased to make some contribution for the poor among the saints at Jerusalem. It was a concerted effort by Paul and his associates to go around collecting relief, materials, money, grain, food to help the brethren who were experiencing severe famine at the time in Jerusalem. So the point I'm making here is that when we talk about famine from a biblical perspective, the authors, the writers, the readers were all familiar with this term and what it meant. But brethren and friends, as we discuss the Revelation 6 seal of the Black Horseman and what it means today, I would like to take us to current affairs to further the discussion. Now, National Geographic, through the National Geographic Society, defines famine as this. Famine is a widespread condition in which a large percentage of people in a country or region have little or no access to adequate food supplies. It further goes on to say different things can cause a famine. A natural disaster such as a long period of drought, flooding, extreme cold, typhoons, insect infestations, or plant disease, combined with government decisions on how to respond to disaster can result in a famine. For example, in North Korea in the 1990s, when the government mismanagement of food supplies and inequitable rationing policy led to famine that killed over 2 million people by some estimates. And if we're supposed to compare to the story of Joseph, we can see how bad government decisions and economic policy can result in the death of millions of persons. Apart from natural disasters, the National Geographic Society defines warfare as a human event that also can lead to famine. It notes here that during war, crops are destroyed, either intentionally or as a result of combat. In addition to supply chains and routes that are cut off, food cannot be distributed or is prevented from being distributed by combatants. Now, brethren and friends, if you think about war and the supply chain that needs to be there to feed the army, as a tactical, strategic step, one would think that to cut off the supply chains is a good idea, to potentially even destroy the agricultural lands to ensure that the invading army can't be fed. This also has an impact on the defending army, because the agricultural lands being destroyed will not have the ability to produce food after a time. And here I have from the Encyclopedia Britannica. It says, the famines that plagued Eastern Europe between 15 and 1700 AD, for example, were chiefly the result of human rather than natural causes, as the warring countries of the regions interfered with and often prevented the production and distribution of basic foodstuffs. The deliberate destruction of crops and food supplies became a common tactic of war in the 19th century, employed by both attacking and defending armies. If it is that an army is invading in your territory and you destroy the agricultural lands that could supply them, you might hope that they will be deterred from further invading. The scorched earth policy adopted by the Russians in 1812 not only deprived Napoleon's armies of needed food, but also starved the Russian people who depended on that land. Just as one example of how this tactic can not only deter the invading army, but can affect your own people. Another interesting point by the National Geographic Society is that forced starvation for political reasons is another cause of famine. It says here, in example, in the Soviet Union of the 1930s, millions of peasants died as a result of the leader at the time, Joseph Stalin's agricultural policies, which required that a quota of grain be supplied to the government before any of the grain could be consumed by those who grew it. Anyone caught violating that policy could be executed. So we have here several reasons for the cause of famine or scarcity, as it were. Three main reasons: natural disaster, warfare, political and economic policy. What does that mean for us today? Let us look at natural disaster. How does that affect us? Now, it is interesting to note that last year at COP26, uniting the world to tackle climate change, there was a global UN conference, the biggest that the UN has for the year, where the world's leaders come together to decide policies that will help to tackle climate change. What we learned from this is that, and I have the note here, our society has become addicted to a lifestyle heavily dependent on mass production of goods, food, and services, and are heavily reliant on the burning of fossil fuels for energy. What this means for our environment is that as the richer countries produce more, they emit greenhouse gases into the environment, which contributes to warming of the earth. What is interesting about this phenomenon is that with the increased temperatures of at 1% since pre-industrial levels, and what that means is that from the 1900s onwards, when the industrial period started, the earth has increased in a global value of 1.5%. And with this increase in just 1 to 1.5%, the world has seen a torrent of deadly weather disasters intensified by climate change in recent months. We've seen asphalt melting heat waves, to flash floods and to untamable wildfires. There's also been a rise in sea levels, and I live in Jamaica. One of my favorite spots is Hellshire. And for persons who are visiting Jamaica who like to go to Hellshire for fish or to enjoy the beach, currently no, there is no beach because of the rising sea levels, removing the sand that was there. Right now it looks more like a cliff than a beach, but that is the effect of the warming that is happening around the world. We've had an increase in powerful storms and also in earthquakes. Haiti can attest to this. And the other day in, I think, 2010, the earthquake would have almost destroyed Haiti completely. We've seen, and more importantly, in the context of this presentation, harsher famines and diminished access to fresh water. What we really learned from COP26 is that there is no equity in the world. The developed nations contribute significantly more to the problem, while less developed nations feel the impact. The trade-off is significant, and the much-needed help that was promised is not forthcoming. We have the usual blockers in these types of agreements at the UN COP. Russia and Saudi Arabia, the second and third largest oil-producing nations, were still blocking the agreement and the way forward. India, South Africa, and China almost derailed the entire conference with last-minute amendments, wanting to change the phrase of the energy restrictions from phase, instead of phasing out, they wanted to say phase down. That means they didn't want to completely stop it, but they just wanted to reduce it so that they could continue to produce. This drew anger from a lot of the delegates that were there, especially from the small island states such as Barbados, Jamaica, just to name a few. And the pledge by wealthy nations to provide annual climate funding of $100 billion from 2020 to poorer countries who bear the greatest impact of warming has not been delivered. Broken promises. There is no equity amongst the world's nations. And what is even more interesting is that as the world contemplated what natural disasters would look like at 2 degrees, we have already seen the effects at 1 degree, 1.5 degree. Imagine if we were at 2 degrees, what that would mean for famines, for agricultural lands, for harsher drought conditions. After considering all of this, the world tried to come together to reduce the greenhouse emissions that they were emitting. 100 countries, including the EU, the USA, pledged to reduce emissions of methane gases by 2030. I have some of the stats here. The US promised to reduce emissions by 50% before 2015 and by 2030. The UK wanted to cut emissions by 80% by 2035. The EU promised to cut emissions by 55% by 2030 and to have carbon neutrality by 2050. Korea also pledged to reduce emissions to 35% by 2030. Canada, to 2050, they wanted to be carbon neutral. India pledged to reach net zero emissions by 2070. The world watched as the largest emitter of greenhouse emissions was yet to make a pledge. This is, of course, China. And having most of the production in terms of electronics and small goods and items be made in China, this would have been significant, whatever their decision is. Instead of siding with the world to reduce carbon emissions by 2030, China completely flipped the script. China planned to bring carbon emissions to a peak before 2030, with carbon neutrality before 2060. Now, friends, the target is by 2050, we can't continue on the same path. It means that if we reach 2050 at these same levels, it is almost a point of no return. Too many people would have died by that time. The state of the earth is going to be very hard to reduce or to return back to normal levels. Yet China, with all this information from the world's top scientists, decided that by 2030, they would have a peak of greenhouse gas emissions. Now, I want to also bring another point. The UN Sustainable Goals or Sustainable Development Goals, there are 17 goals to transform our world by 2030. And this was a part of the Paris Accords that was signed by the United Nations. I want to bring your attention to goal number 2, which says here, zero hunger by 2030. I want you to also note on the agenda, goal 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions. And I also want you to note goal 13 for climate action. Now, goal number 2, zero hunger. Can you imagine it, friends? Zero hunger in the next 8 years. By 2030, the world should be on track to have zero hunger by 2030. But this is not the case. If the recent trends continue, the number of people affected by hunger would surpass 840 million persons by 2030. The sustainable goals are a call for action by all countries, poor, rich, and middle income, to promote prosperity while protecting the planet. They recognize that ending poverty must go hand in hand with strategies that build economic growth and address a range of social needs, including education, health, social protection, and job opportunities, while tackling climate change and environmental protection. Is this really possible? Can the world with the United Nations achieve this? By all intents and purposes and what is going on, the answer is simply no. What about the world's churches? What are their views? The Pope here addressed the UN and put forward the Catholic response to these SDG goals. We have also the Anglican Communion, who has also pledged to put activities with the hope of enabling the world to achieve these goals. We have the Presbyterians, we have the Episcopalians, different church organizations or religious organizations, all telling the world and its members that this is achievable. The question we have to ask ourselves is, are these religious organizations today wrong in thinking that they can end world hunger, although the Bible clearly says otherwise? Another interesting thing about famine in our current affairs or today's society is the link between conflict and hunger in the 21st century. Dr. Chakrabarty is a research fellow with the Climate Change and Development Initiative. Her research interests encompass issues related to economic and social development in Africa and India, and the links between climate change, agriculture, and food security. She points out in a brief that she wrote, the enduring link between conflict and hunger in the 21st century. The brief argues that the current global order will fail in preventing mass starvation unless it fulfills goals not only on ending hunger, but also those on promoting peace, justice, and institutions. Peace building should be an essential component of the fight against hunger. What she's essentially saying is unless war and conflict disappear from the earth, famines will continue. The Bible gives us some insight into this link between war and famine. And 2 weeks ago, Elder Horain Smith would have shown us that by all intents, indicators, and purposes, war will increase. The prophet Jeremiah, in Jeremiah 5:12 here says, they belied the Lord and said, it is not he, neither shall evil come upon us, neither shall we see sword nor famine. In Jeremiah 11:22, therefore thus says the Lord of hosts, behold, I will punish them. The young men shall die by the sword, their sons and their daughters shall die by famine. Jeremiah 14:12-13 speaks about the prophets. It says, but I will consume them by the sword and by the famine and by the pestilence. Jeremiah 14:15 once again makes this link between the sword, war, and famine, where it says, sword and famine shall not be in this land. By sword and famine shall those prophets be consumed, talking about their disobedience. Separate and apart from natural events or natural disasters, war, the second cause of famine, is also on the increase. And that leads to scarcity and mass starvation. Or headlines or newspapers or radio programs are filled with different news reports about the increase in war and the effects on the people. Today we read about the war in Ukraine and between Ukraine and Russia. And the reality is that Ukraine and Russia exports a lot of wheat to some of the most dependent countries around the world. Today, there's a lot of starvation and increased famine in East Africa because of the current war in Ukraine and Russia. The persons here don't have access to the regular wheat that is exported from Ukraine and goes to Africa because of the blockade and the destruction of agricultural lands. We also read about inflation increasing. We have seen, for example, in Jamaica, BOJ notes that the inflation was at 7.3%, the highest in the last decade, usually at a growth rate of about 4%. We've seen record highs this year. This is also prevalent in the United States, where the headlines reads, US inflation hits highest level in 40 years in January as prices rise 7.5%. What this means is that the cost of food has increased, but our salaries are not going up. The same money that we used to pay for a loaf of bread last year will not be the same price this year. We can afford less things with the same money. And it's not only inflation with food, gas prices are also soaring. We've seen with the war between Ukraine and Russia that the largest producer of oil, or second the largest producer of oil in terms of Russia, no longer allowed to export oil to other countries. This means that oil becomes more scarce and more expensive. Oil and gas that is needed to drive tractors and helping developing agricultural lands. As the wars continue, brethren, inflation will undoubtedly increase. Gas prices will undoubtedly soar. But what about war? Will it slow down? Elder Horain Smith alluded to this in his presentation on the Second Horseman. What we have seen is that the world's military spending has risen to $2 trillion in 2020. China has also committed to spending more in terms of defense in 2022. We have seen Germany, in response to Putin's war in Russia against Ukraine, also commit to spend 100 billion euros in defense spending. We've also seen that Saudi Arabia is trying to increase in military spending. And let us not forget Iran, who is currently now trying to build a nuclear bomb with their arch rivals Israel looking onwards. By all indications, friends, war will not decrease, it will only increase. And our expectation is that famine and inflation will always increase along with warfare. This is the reality of our current affairs and what is currently happening now. There's another interesting tactic that is happening globally that we ought to take note of, and that is the weaponizing of trade. What we have been seeing, friends, is that some of the world's most powerful countries are starting to use economic sanctions to drive scarcity in countries, to get them to bend to their policies. We've seen examples with Cuba, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, all receiving economic sanctions to deter them on a particular path. But it does not stop with trade and also economic policy. We've seen the EU use economic sanctions to defund, for example, Polish towns over LGBT issues. Poland, certain towns were trying to defend their right to look to the Bible and to talk out against the normalization of these sexual practices. And what was their response? What did they get? They got economic sanctions. Ultimately, what we're seeing is a trend that around the world, if you stand up for God or biblical principles, or if you don't play nice, famine, scarcity will be your response from the world. It's a grim picture. How do the people of God reflect on this? How do we think about this? Well, I, for one, friends, I'm not scared. I only look to the love of God and his protection. And we would have seen this in the Bible in previous times. Although the world rages, we know that God can protect us from anything that the world throws at us. I take you back to Exodus 7-12, where we read about the 12 plagues that would have happened in Egypt. Egypt experienced a lot of the plagues, I believe from 4 onwards, were some of the worst ones. However, we read, for example, in Exodus 8, that God was able to still protect his people and set apart wherever they lived to ensure that none of the plagues could affect them. Brethren, we don't look to the world in fear of what they can do or what economic sanctions that they have. We only look to God and what he can do. And as the Olivet prophecy does tell us, this is only the beginning of birth pain. So we do expect it to get worse. And it also says that mankind's heart will get cold. Are the other churches right? Can they achieve this target? By all accounts, the answer is no. But what about in the future kingdom? I would like to talk to you about a particular prophecy in Zechariah. But I would like to take you first from Acts 1. And in verse 6, an interesting scenario is painted, which I'll pick up on in Zechariah 14, coming up next. In Acts 1:6, it records how the Lord was with his disciples at the last time. And they asked him an important question. They asked him, Lord, will you at this time restore the kingdom to Israel? He said to them, it is not for you to know the times or the seasons which a father has fixed by his own authority. But you shall receive power with the Holy Spirit when the Holy Spirit has come upon you. And you shall be my witness in Jerusalem and all Judea and Samaria and to the end of the earth. And in verse 9 it says, and when he said this, as they were looking on, he was lifted up, and a cloud took him out of their sight. And while they were gazing into heaven as he went, behold, 2 men stood by them in white robes, and said, Men of Galilee, why do you stand looking into heaven? This Jesus who was taken up from you into heaven will come in the same way as you saw him go into heaven. They then turned, friends, and then went to Jerusalem from the place that was called the mount called Olivet, or the Mount of Olives, which is near Jerusalem. Why am I bringing this up? A lot of churches teach that when the Messiah comes, some of us will be whisked away to heaven, or that the entirety of mankind will be destroyed. But friends, as we examine the biblical scriptures, we see that that is indeed not true. Because as we turn to Zechariah 14, we have a prophecy of our Lord and Savior returning to the earth. It says here in Zechariah 14, Behold, the day of the Lord is coming, when the spoil taken from you will be divided in the midst of you. For I will gather all nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city shall be taken, and the houses plundered, and the women ravished. I want to make sure that we understand that in verse 4, it is definitively saying that the Messiah will return to this earth. In verse 4, it says, On that day his feet shall stand on the Mount of Olives, which lies before Jerusalem on the east. In Acts 1, we see where the two men said to the disciples that in the same way, at the same place that Jesus left and went to heaven, that he will return and stand on the Mount of Olives. The disciples at the time would have known about Zechariah and the expectation of a coming kingdom that will be established. But friends, it doesn't stop there. Am I saying that there will be no famine when the Messiah returns? On the contrary, I want to bring your attention to what the millennial kingdom says about the possibility of famine still existed. Not like what the world or the churches teach or expect, but let us go biblically to see what is said. Here, I want to bring your attention to verse 12. It says, And this will be the plague with which the Lord will smite all the peoples that wage war against Jerusalem. It goes through a series of plagues. And I want to be very clear that in 14, it says, Even Judah will fight against him at Jerusalem. And the wealth of all the nations round about shall be collected, gold, silver, and garments in great abundance. Yes, friends, what this is indeed saying is that when the Lord returns, all the kingdoms will be subject to his rulership and to his kingdom that will be established in Jerusalem. But this is not the point that I'm even trying to make. I just want to establish that we are very clear that what the churches teach about going to heaven, or that there will be no people on the earth at the Lord's return, is false. What we continue to see in Zechariah 14 comes to a culmination, or to my main point, in verse 16. It says here, Then everyone that survives all the nations that have come against Jerusalem shall go up year after year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to keep the Feast of Booths. And if any of the families of the earth do not go up to Jerusalem to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, there will be no rain upon them. That's right, friends. As we're looking into the prophecies of what the Bible itself tells us, when the Lord establishes his kingdom on this earth, if the nations that we see now who have no equity, who have no honor amongst each other, do not go up to worship the King, they themselves at that time will have no rain. And we know that without rain, it brings drought, and it means that it will be hardships for breaking the commands of God. But it means that these nations will have to go up and to celebrate, more importantly, the Feast of Tabernacles. What is that? What does it mean? As we continue to read in verse 18, it says, And if the family of Egypt do not go up and present themselves, then upon them shall come the plague with which the Lord afflicts the nations that do not go up to keep the Feast of Booths. In 19, it says, This shall be the punishment to Egypt, and the punishment to all the nations that do not go up to keep the Feast of Booths. We see this Feast of Booths listed in Leviticus 23, along with the weekly Sabbath. Here in verse 33 of Leviticus 23, it's a commandment, an instruction given to the people of God. And it says, and the Lord said to Moses, say to the people of Israel, on the 15th day of the 7th month, and for 7 days is a feast of booths to the Lord. We see this as a clear commandment in the Bible that people, nations, if they do not keep in this future kingdom, they will have no rain. Henceforth, famine may be upon them. We see Jesus himself keeping this feast of booths in John 7 and verses 10 to 16. It records how Jesus was at the feast celebrating this commandment that was given from Leviticus. And once again, for persons who are interested, persons who want to be called the people of God, people who could potentially be protected from famine in this time. We see here John 14:15 says, where Jesus commands, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. Brethren, I would like to just end this presentation by giving a message of hope that although we see the nations of the world continue to engage in war and engage in economic sanctions against each other, engaging in unfair environmental practices, not caring about the millions who are dying through starvation, we still do have a hope in this coming kingdom of God, which will have laws. And for people who want to be citizens of this kingdom, it's important that we understand who God is, what his laws are, and how they are to be kept during this time. And there is a reward for the person who turns their life over to God at this time. It reads here in Revelation 2:26 with a promise from Jesus, the Messiah himself, he who conquers and keeps my works until the end, I will give him power over the nations, and he shall rule them with a rod of iron, as when earthen pottings are broken into pieces. Even as I myself have received power from my Father, and I will give him the morning star. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. I would just like to thank you for staying with us to listen to this presentation on the third horseman of the apocalypse, the Black Horseman, speaking about famine that will increase in the world. We see it with current affairs. We see it in our very Bibles. But yet we're not alarmed. We're not afraid of what is to come. We only wait in great expectation. I'd just like to thank you once again, and remember to join us next week as we conclude this series with a presentation on the fourth horseman representing death, presented by Elder George Ramakan. And at this time, I'd just like to turn over and invite the panel for question and answers and for a lively discussion.
Well, thank you very much, Brother Ray, for that very enlightening and insightful presentation on the Black Horse. We've certainly received quite a bit of information, very, very informative, very, very insightful. And so we will now open our panel discussion, and our panel this afternoon will be the presenter himself, our Brother Ray Williams, and we'll also be joined here by Brother Hareen Smith, and myself will be the moderator. My name is Kenmore Allen. Okay, so let me see if we have any questions from, I don't think we have any questions yet from the audience, but what we can do is just, all right, so there are no questions from the audience yet, but I do have some, some things we can go on here to just spark some discussion. I think similar to what we have heard before in the other horsemen, the other two that have been presented, often the question is asked, these are things, we talk about war, we talk about deception. These are things that have been happening over time. And the question then is, and we can ask the same question with regards to this Black Horseman riding, this horseman which represents famine. How will we know? How will we know when the Black Horseman is actually riding? And I throw that out to both the presenter and Brother Hareen himself. Anyone can take a shot at that. How will we know when this Black Horseman is actually riding?
Okay, that's a very, if Ray don't mind, I'll probably just chime in here.
Yeah, I'll chime in after you.
That's a very timely question, Brother Ken. And Ray brought up those points in his presentation, and I'm glad he did, because the current environment we have, one could easily draw the conclusion that yes, so we have established already that these horsemen, the way they ride, there are linkages between them. For example, the red horseman, a picture of war. War leads to famine, and then we'll see obviously next Sunday as well that famine leads to pestilences and so on. So we can establish those links. If we look at what's going on now with the war in the Ukraine, we know already the effect that war is having on food prices and will have on food prices, because the Ukraine is and Russia, they're large exporters of corn and wheat and some other cereals, and especially corn, which figures prominently in the manufacture of animal feed and so on. There's also the energy aspect to it, because both nations are also energy producing nations. And when it comes to energy and production of anything, primarily food, we can see again the effect it will have. You know, I was just reading a couple of days ago the prices of nitrogen and potassium and phosphorus that are used in the manufacture of fertilizer have skyrocketed, and the impact that will have on food supplies this year. So if you're reading and following what's going on, you're saying, well, this year is shaping up to be an interesting year. Is the horseman riding? Is this black horseman riding, or any horseman riding for that matter? Because as I said, we established already that the second horseman is war. The first horseman is deception that has been going on for ages. So we look at all of these horsemen and we see an element of continuity in terms of the effects that they've been having on people. Wars and famine and deception have been going on, and now we're also dealing with a pandemic. The pandemic too has had an effect on global food production. We provided some hints on that as well, and some information on that as well. It's devastating to many countries, especially the poorer countries, to be able to import food when their economies have been so much affected by the pandemic. So we see the effects that all of this is having on a global scale. So the big question, yes, on the minds of many, are the horsemen riding? Is there worse to come, or this is just a warming up? And again, Ray touched on a very important, I said it last week in my presentation, and I'm going to repeat it for emphasis, because he touched on a very important prophecy in the Olivet prophecy of Matthew 24. It talks about the birth pangs, or some translations refer to it as the beginning of sorrows. So sorrow is a better translation. It's really birth pangs. What birth pangs basically means is that it intensifies. It as time goes by and there's an occurrence, each time it comes much worse. What we can see now, and what is described in the book of Revelation, the book of Revelation being the apocalypse, that things that are happening will have global effects. Well, you know what? The Ukraine war is just basically a regional war, but it does have global effects as well. Are we going to see something bigger than the Ukraine war? Well, remember, we're in an environment where there are several nations that are armed with nuclear weapons. Historically, it has been proven that the weapons that humanity has manufactured, that have all been used. But nuclear war, we haven't had one yet. From what we see in the Bible, a time is coming when we're about to blow ourselves off the earth. That's when Jesus Christ will intervene. So the point I'm trying to make here is, yes, one can say we have seen the effects of these four horsemen, but are they on that horse, figuratively speaking, riding as Revelation describes them? I would say, from what we've seen in the scriptures, it's just the beginning of sorrows. As it says, it's a warming up. There's much worse to come when these horsemen are riding. And it will be obvious to the child of God, because we will see that these are the conditions in which we're going to be existing will be abnormal. They won't be the norm. They'll be out of the norm. And I know in the 80s, for example, there was this great Ethiopian famine where we were greeted at night with graphic images on our television screens of children dying in Ethiopia. We haven't had that kind of publicity since the 1980s about famine, but famine has been going on. The World Food Program says at least 3 million people, children rather, die each year of hunger-related diseases. So all of that has been going on, but all of what we are seeing here is pointing to greater intensity. So there's a warming up going
Thank,
on,
thank,
and I would
thank
say
you.
they're about to ride.
Yeah. So if maybe just to sum it up, I would say these horsemen, in a sense, have been riding, but what we should be looking for is the intensity and the impact of it. Something came to mind here. You talk about the from the Matthew 24 Olivet prophecy, where it talks about the birth pangs. Yes, you know, you may well say the woman is already pregnant, but we will know as we get closer to that delivery date.
At birth. Yeah.
All right, thank you. I have another question here.
Sorry,
Maybe,
before we move on, I just wanted to add as
sure.
well. I think even in discussion with Elder Scale, we were talking about the same intensity, and I mean, I myself have never been pregnant, but my wife has been pregnant. So, um, what you realize about the birth pains is that, as you said, as time progresses, the birth pains start to get more frequent and also they increase in intensity. And what we have
Yes.
seen undoubtedly is that deception has been on the increase. We have seen wars been on the increase, increasing in intensity. We've seen famines on the increase, increasing with intensity. So I think what Jesus's prophecy would have done for me as a Christian, especially, is I'm not alarmed. And I think that is the comfort that I have with everything that I'm seeing going on in the world. I am not alarmed because at the end of the day, we are looking for the establishment of a kingdom on this earth that will bring about real justice, real peace. And as we see the world grappling with these issues, we see that they cannot come together to solve it together. And it just brings me hope in terms of waiting for the establishment of the kingdom of the earth and for the Messiah himself to put things right. So don't be alarmed, but you have to be a person of God, in tune with the scriptures, practicing his laws, and understanding who he is to have this peace of mind as well.
Thank you. Yeah, maybe I'll address this one to you then, Brother Ray. And you gave us the parallel there with the Olivet prophecy from Matthew 24 and identifying, of course, the black horse as a horse of famine. And you also gave us quite a bit of information with regards to nations and even international efforts that are being made to address this question of food security. And we know some nations are doing that in terms of stockpiling grains and so on, and other non-perishables. And you mentioned, I think, the Sustainable Development Goals, one of which was zero hunger by 2030. Now, my question to you is, do you think measures that are being taken, for food security to, offset anything, what might be coming up in terms of a global famine, do you think that any of these measures that are being taken will actually be able to deal with the reality of a global famine?
Yeah, in response to that question, let me first on all say, although despite my views, I still think we have an individual responsibility to contribute to the well-being of our society, and we should, with everything that we have, continue to do that. Because at the end of the day, we are looking towards our brothers and sisters who are out there, and it's unfortunate that the people are suffering in this way. However, with that said, given the three different reasons that we've seen for famine, natural disasters, for example, very hard to control, it's very unpredictable, and I don't think that is factored into the plan. So with the increase in natural disasters, I don't think the answer can be a yes. We've seen these different conferences happen before the pandemic. And what they've actually said is that we would have to go through 8 years of pandemic conditions. That means reduction in travel, reduction in movement for you to meet the target that they have set. I don't see that happening with where the world is going. So for me, the answer is a no. If we look at, for example, war and the economic sanctions that are there, we see, for example, Iran trying to get a nuclear weapon. We see what is going on in terms of the Middle East with Israel being at the forefront of a lot of the conflict that is going on there. And we also see a rise of Muslim coalition, the south of Israel, with a coalition in the north in terms of the European Union, the United Nations, and the West. And from this religious ideology standpoint, the war, the economic sanctions don't look like it will be deterrent, because you're talking about, doing away with, harmony, unity, and persons are now divided by religious belief. So I expect the wars, the economic sanctions to continue, especially with the trade war going between the United States and China, especially. I expect inflation to increase. So, when I look at the plans for 2030, what they have developed, considering the natural disasters, the impact of war, the weaponization of economics, and also just the ideologies that are out there in the world, the answer for me is a definite no. Definite no. So I think that persons should not feel dejected, but if you look to the Bible, as I said, you can draw comfort in that these things were prophesied by our Messiah, and we wait for his kingdom.
Yeah, I just add to that last point that Ray touched on. I think we have to see this as part of the divine order. It's inevitable, and that's what the book of Revelation is all about. It unfolds exactly some of the things that will play out in the time of the end. So what we're seeing here is, in essence, the divine intervention on planet Earth. So no matter how they come with all the different strategies to try to prevent these, whether it's famine or war, it is still going to happen.
Yes. Okay.
I have a question for you, Brother Ken, and for the panelists, if you don't mind me asking. A lot of times persons ask, okay, you have these prophecies about famine, you have, these prophecies about war. What does that mean today as a Christian? Even if you do believe in the Messiah, should we be practical in terms of looking towards getting our own farmlands, making sure that we have access to food in terms of food security? Because, we see, for example, in Exodus, the Israelites did have agricultural land. We see, for example, Paul in the New Testament did go around with different persons of means, gathering things together to help the relief efforts for brethren around the world. So, as a church body and believing Christians, should we also engage in practical things in terms of ensuring food security?
Yeah, all right, I'll take a shot. Actually, that was my next question I was going to ask you, in terms of
I'm sorry.
What can we do individually and nationally to prepare for this global famine, that is to come? Yeah, I do believe we have a responsibility and we have to do something, and we don't just sit by. We know God will protect us, and you talk about having confidence in the fact that God will protect us. But there are things we can do. I mean, we can start, where possible, growing our own things, maybe things that you grow and then you can preserve them, things that you can stock, that you can keep. So we can do a number of these things. And we also have to be prepared, I think, to help one another. You mentioned in 1 Corinthians 16 there, where the Jerusalem church, other church areas where they weren't affected by famine, were actually reaching out to help them. So I think there are a number of practical things we can do. And I think God expects us to do whatever we can in terms of growing our own things, whether it's your little backyard garden. At least you might have something to be able to share with others. So, of course, we know that the time is also coming when, the mark of the beast will be imposed, and we won't be able to do business. We won't be able to maybe even own any properties. So I don't know if some of those things are going to play out and what effect that might have on our ability to deal with these things. But I do believe, apart from us doing whatever we can, we, of course, have to trust God, just as he did for others throughout history, protecting them, providing for them under trying situations like these. Brother Rain, you can.
Yeah, I supported it 100%. I don't think any Christian should stand with their arms folded and say, well, the kingdom is coming, so I can just relax, or I don't have to do that or this or that. No, we all have a responsibility to ourselves, to our families, to society, to our church brother, and, even those in the secular world, to ensure that we do what we have to do. Go and study, whether you're going to be an agronomist or a food chemist, whatever. Go and study, and still life continues as normal. But the difference for the child of God is that we know this is not going to last forever. A time is coming when all of that will just come to a halt. So yes, we continue to do what we normally do, but don't lose faith.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that.
Okay. You touched also in your presentation on Zechariah 14, the fact that we will no doubt be experiencing famine, during the millennial period at the return of Christ, talking about those nations who refuse to obey God's appointed times. There'll be no rain on them, and consequently no rain to water the crops. We'll have famine. But does the Bible give us any hope of a time when the whole world will be free from the threat of famine or the reality of famine? Do we see any hope from Scripture of that?
Yeah, and particularly, we understand the work of Jesus, that he is coming here to eradicate sin from the world. The millennial reign is just a step in the ultimate, which is in terms of Revelation 21, where we'll see a new heaven and a new earth being created. And therefore, we look forward to the time where the Father himself with the New Jerusalem will be coming known. So our understanding of the Messiah's return is to complete the work of renewing the heavens and the earth for the Father ultimately coming down. So although in Zechariah 14 it describes the situation of his millennial reign, there is hope at the end. And if we read Revelations completely, we see this great utopia. But as I said, the only way to be a part of this utopia is if you do commit to being a child of God. You hear these words, you look at his laws, you live towards righteousness, and you shall be a part in this. So we definitely look forward to that time. And I know the presentation was about 50% gloom and doom, but there is hope at the end of it all.
Absolutely, there is hope. Brother Rainier.
Yes, and that is what so Revelation gives you a worst case scenario, and then in the conclusion, when you read Revelation 20, 21, and 22, it just makes up for all of the gloom and doom that you've gone through in the previous chapters. And that is why we as Christians, we're a people of hope, because we realize that before our joy is going to be filled, that we're going to go through a rough time, and that rough time is upon us. I noticed there's a question in the chat too about the purpose of the prophecy that the question is being asked. Can you share it? And I was coming to that point too, that basically these prophecies, this four horse, if we're talking about this specifically, the third horseman that was dealt with today, it's, put it this way, it's all part of a package of prophetical developments that will carpet this earth before Jesus Christ returns. So the third horseman basically is the third seal of seven seals that will cause a lot of destruction and death on the planet. And it does, while it doesn't stand out by itself, it's related to other prophecies that's going to happen. So the purpose here is not just for a single event. It's part of a whole grand scheme of God's intervention on planet Earth. So we have to see it that way.
Thank you. And as I think about that, one of these prophetic scriptures I think about is from Amos chapter 9. Amos chapter 9, which verse 12 through 14, it says, "Behold, the days come, says the Lord, that the plowman shall overtake the reaper, and the treader of grapes him that sow seed. And the mountains shall drop sweet wine, and all the hills shall melt. And I will bring again the captivity of my people Israel, and they shall build the waste cities and inhabit them, and they shall plant vineyards and drink the wine thereof. They shall also make gardens and eat the fruit thereof. So, we see now, I mean, a lot of what we're seeing happening now, shortage of food, and there's just not enough to go around. A time is going to come when, the people who are reaping the greens, the people who are reaping the fields, they'll be overtaken by those who are actually doing the sowing. So ultimately, and the time is coming when food shortages, famine, and all of those things will be history, and we look forward to that time. Okay, I don't know if any other.
There's a question in the chat, Ken. There's a question about would
horsemen still be riding until Christ?
Yeah.
Okay, so throw that to you guys.
Repeat the question.
So they're asking if the horsemen will still be riding until when Christ return, the four horsemen.
Yeah, I mean, that is my understanding. When Jonah dealt with the first horseman in terms of deception, what we understand when the Messiah comes is that the laws will go out from Jerusalem. So the deception that happens in the world currently right now will not be at that time. We also read of the times that he will put down war. So, in Isaiah 2, Micah 4 as well, we see that, war will not be anymore. And from all intents and purposes, what we do see is that, the persons who obey and go up to Jerusalem, if the nations will be turning their weapons into plowshares, it would seem like there is going to be a time of agriculture and peace, as well as we see, prophecies around the fact that persons will, if they die at 100 years, they'll be considered cursed or infant. So we expect life expectancy to also increase. So my understanding is that when the Messiah returns, the four horsemen will come to an end in terms of reigning, but his millennial reign will take over, where he will continue the work of eradicating sin and bringing about the new heavens and the new earth.
Thank you very much. So thank you, panelists, for all that you have shared with us and the questions you've answered. We just close the scripture that Brother Ray just referred to there from Isaiah 2 or Micah. I'll read it from Isaiah chapter 2. It says, and he shall judge among the nations, and shall rebuke many people, and they shall beat their swords or implements of war into plowshares, agricultural machinery, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. This is the time we look forward to. And as Brother Ray showed in his presentation, for us to benefit from this and not have to suffer the scourge of famine and all the fallout from that, is that we make sure we be on the Lord's side. We make sure that we commit our ways to him, following in his path. And we're sure we'll have the protection, we'll have the provisions for us. And may God bless you all, and thank you for joining us. And we look forward to your joining us next week at the same time, I think 3 o'clock again, for the Fourth Horseman presentation. And we'll have our presenter, Brother George Ramakan, to do that one for us. So have a good evening, and may God bless you all.
Thanks very much.
Thanks.